if you read the papers about the models, the modelers say, depending on the assumptions, we can show sea level deceleration or linearity or accelerations.
From rising sea levels to surging forest fires to dying polar bears to disappearing coral reefs, much of what we've been told about climate change is just not true, says Michael Shellenberger, the author of Apocalypse Never and founder of Public.News.
I think that those scientists that manipulate the data to show certain things, I think they really are apocalyptic. Like, they really think that the world is going to come to an end, but then they look at their data and their data don't show that, so then they have to mess with it.
At the same time, Bill Gates has recently come out to declare the quote doomsday view of climate change is wrong. Are we seeing a shift away from climate alarmism and the net zero agenda? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Michael Shellenberger, so good to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Jan, great to be back with you.
So, Michael, is the era of climate extremists destroying priceless works of art now over?
That's a really interesting question. It feels like it's coming to an end. I mean, we still see, as you mentioned, vandalism, most recently against Stonehenge. In fact, those protesters got let off the hook by the courts for what they did. I think in terms of legitimacy, yeah, I mean, climate extremism, I think, has lost a lot of legitimacy over the last 5 or 6 years. The most kind of obvious part of that is Bill Gates recently said that we really shouldn't look at climate separate from human welfare, separate from human, like how we're doing, at a human level. And on that, on those metrics, we're doing well. I mean, we are more resilient to extreme weather events. The number of disasters has gone down because the number of deaths and the cost of disasters has gone down. So fewer people are dying from hurricanes and floods and all the other things that were supposed to hurt us. And then I think most dramatically, I think, and others finally understand that there was a manipulation going on a lot of other data, including your organization, which was censored by Facebook for sharing accurate information about the fact that there's been no decline in sea ice in the Arctic for 20 years. And then we've also seen now it's clear that the activist scientists were manipulating models to show an acceleration in sea level rise, when the only long-term reliable source of data, which is called tide gauge data, just measuring the tides, shows no acceleration from the 1850s on. And that doesn't mean that that climate isn't changing. I think the planet is changing. It doesn't mean that humans don't have an influence. I think we do have an influence. But the size of that influence, I think, for me, it's even less than maybe I thought a few years ago. I was reporting, even after I wrote Apocalypse Never, my book from 2020 on environmental alarmism, I was still repeating the ostensible scientific view that sea levels that the rise was accelerating. I don't think I can say that anymore. That's part of the reason I wrote those recent pieces. But then when you just go through all the other metrics, yeah, I mean, there's just not really any case to be made.
I want to touch on one other thing. I went to a round table of basically energy experts. Real Clear Politics organized it here in DC recently. But as it went around, I thought to myself, wait a second, all these people are talking about right now is how are we going to get enough energy into these AI data centers? It's an existential crisis. And I thought to myself, wait a sec, is net zero dead? Is degrowth actually dead? And I asked that question, and essentially what everybody would tell me is there's no more talk about net zero, and so this information that you're bringing forth kind of fits with this rubric, but it also makes me wonder if this isn't sort of a convenient revealing of information at an appropriate time, as everyone seems to be maddeningly gearing up to build as many data centers and electricity production facilities as possible.
Yeah, I mean, look, anytime you see such a big change in the discourse and the kind of conventional wisdom as measured by Bill Gates, I would say he kind of represents the left end of the conventional wisdom. And So his announcement is coming at a time, as you rightly point out, that the main focus of policymakers, and probably in both parties, certainly in the Republicans, but probably also in the Democrat Party too, is just getting enough energy to power the data centers. And we see we need more electricity. Electricity prices have been going up largely in response to renewables and these renewables policies. But there's also just rising demand. And I think that's just a huge factor that is changing the conversation. But it's a lot of things. I mean, there's a lot of people that for years have been pointing out that the data is just not there for an alarmist case. And not only that, but actually the system, the so-called energy system is doing a pretty good job on its own of decarbonizing. Just there's so much more abundant natural gas, some of it not even being tapped. So I think in the United States, by the way, the conversation has completely changed, and now we're a pro-energy growth country. Europe, it hasn't. So the British are still not tapping into their natural gas reserves that they have. They're still trying to do a lot of wind, which is making electricity expensive. Germany is in a state of degrowth and deindustrialization. And I think in some ways it's just, committing suicide as a nation through its energy policies. But I think that where things are headed, I think where the left is going to have to go is going to have to go towards more abundant energy production. And that's going to be from things like natural gas and nuclear that were, verboten just a few years ago.
Well, this is another thing that I heard at that roundtable. It's clear that nuclear is going to be sort of full steam ahead, quite literally, I suppose. But, you actually did your work in your book, Apocalypse Never. This is actually how we actually met, looking at all these questions. But it's very interesting that you were saying that your own research hadn't told you how far it had gone, how far this manipulation actually went. That I find that quite astonishing.
Yeah, I think on a couple of points, and I just published another interview with Judith Curry, who's a climate scientist, atmospheric scientist, professor emerita at Georgia Tech, kind of unquestionable credentials, thinks humans are having an impact on the climate. I asked her, so what percentage did she think that we were responsible with our both land use changes, which is also underestimated probably, as well as our carbon emissions? And she said, probably 50%. The conventional wisdom is that humans are 100% responsible for all the warming. She said probably somewhere around 50%. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that, we were headed into, she thinks that we would be headed into a cooling period if we were not contributing greenhouse gases to warming the planet. And then the third most kind of, jarring part of this is that, and it's not controversial at all, actually, is that warming is much better than cooling. And so, just at a simple matter of deaths from cold significantly outnumber deaths from heat. Those three things, that there's still a lot of natural variability in this complicated planet system that we have. We don't totally understand it. It's hard to measure it exactly. That that really we might be cooling now if it weren't for our interventions of our unintended effects of warming, and that warming can be good. And so if all else being equal, it's literally the opposite of pessimism. You'd kind of be on the side of like, wow, we kind of lucked out in a variety of ways. This is not reason for any apocalyptic thinking. And therefore, all of the apocalyptic thinking is really motivated by other things, including I think the heart of it is a kind of Malthusian, anti-human, humans are bad, they're a cancer on the earth, there's too many of them. Everybody knows that story because we teach it to our kids, and it's like a staple of Hollywood movies and television. But, that's kind of what motivated a lot of it. And, even I look at the sea level scientists that I think were involved in mischief. There's certainly more truth in climate change than there is in, say, transgenderism, but they just exaggerated it to such an extent that it really became the opposite of what it is, which is something that, that it's not the end of the world. It's not entirely from humans. And it's certainly better, to the extent to which we're going to have some impact on the planet, it's certainly better to be in the direction of warming than cooling.
Michael, one quick sec. We're going to take a break. And folks, we're going to be right back. And we're back with Michael Shellenberger, founder of Public.News and professor at the University of Austin. You know, in your interview with Judith Curry, which I perused, that was kind of the most striking thing, was just simply her assertion. The most important thing to know is that global warming isn't actually bad, isn't actually dangerous. And somehow yet we have, as you point out in your recent piece, there's all sorts of people that have been driven to, mental illness, to being extreme, as I mentioned at the beginning, of destroying priceless. We're going to the great efforts to destroy priceless works of art that are caught in this kind of, social contagion of climate alarmism, while in reality, it's actually something that's at least neutral, if not positive.
Yeah, and that means you have to look for different causes. That certainly scientists who are motivated misled people, but people were inclined to be catastrophic in ways that they weren't in the past. I mean, I always point out one of the other pieces of data, because we had this big heat spell. We basically had faster sea level rise from the 20s to the 50s than we did from the 50s to the 80s. And then we've had a faster rise since the 90s, but not significantly faster than that period from the 20s to the 50s. That's also accompanied by a spike in heat waves in the 30s. Well, I went back and just for fun, I read all of the New York Times coverage of the heat waves in the 1930s. And Jan, what was so interesting about it is how relaxed they were. I mean, they had hundreds of people were dying in heat waves, like in buildings. And the New York Times people were kind of downplaying it. I mean, you're in the midst of the Great Depression, right? It's 1930s. It's, there's, it's also the Dust Bowl period, right? So people, it's bad times, and they're kind of like, well, yeah, the heat wave is like the least of it. Whereas I think that it's really has to do with a lot of different things, obviously, for it to be such a big phenomenon. I mean, part of it is, just what I was saying about a kind of anti-human ideology. I think some of it is some class interests that are served by wanting to promote certain things like renewables or financializing carbon emissions through carbon markets at the United Nations. And there's the power trips, the attention for Greta Thunberg or the United Nations Secretary General or the president or former president or other politicians. They get some narcissistic rewards. And then you can't help but notice that it's an apocalyptic discourse, which sociologists and historians have studied for hundreds of years. A millenarian end of the world is nigh. We have a lot of psychological studies of the kind of people attracted to those those apocalyptic cults. These are sort of lost souls, people that are really kind of a lot of failed artists. I noticed that that's a kind of a category of folks involved in those the vandalism protests. But, people used to have in the United States, mostly a Christian, belief system, and it had a story about original sin and, and then the end of times, the revelations. Well, when people stop believing in that, they don't really stop needing a kind of cosmological explanation of things. It sort of emerges organically through the culture, I think, that sort of apocalyptic story. And I think a sense of, at a time when, it was a time of anxiety, as the Cold War was over, we had a stand-in apocalyptic event in the form of the risk of nuclear war. When that goes away at the end of communism is when in the early 90s, that's when you see climate changing emerging as an apocalyptic story. So, to sum it all up, I would just say, I think the climate alarmism was a kind of, a generalized anxiety disorder among, college educated elites who were trying to sort of virtue signal, feel good about themselves, give their lives purpose and meaning. It's not to downplay the financial interests or the kind of the power tripping by various people. But I think in some ways it's just a disordered psychological or spiritual response from people that, have lost their faith.
Yeah, and there's this other element of very deliberate manipulation, which is something that you highlight in this recent work that you've done. And you alluded to it a little bit earlier when you were talking about, the trends change over time. So if you pick a very specific time and you avoid mentioning the context of that, you can make something look really dramatic and problematic that actually isn't. But can you trace for me some of the major ways in which, you can see this deliberate manipulation actually happening?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's fascinating. Even if you're not interested in climate change, watching people that are very dogmatic about something, people that are in their own dream world, sort of manipulate things. Because I think that those scientists that manipulate the data or manipulate their studies to show certain things, I think they really are apocalyptic. Like, they really think that the world is going to come to an end. But then they look at their data and their data don't show that. So then they have to mess with it. So in terms of the sea level rise, really you just have this one set of data from tide gauges around the world. And when just doesn't matter how you've got to do some corrections and whatnot, but basically anybody that looks at that body of data says we can't see a long-term acceleration. You can pick periods of acceleration and deceleration, 1920 to 1950, 1990 to today. But then when you just go and say, oh, but then you didn't see that during these other decades, well, then it's not a long-term trend. And climate change is just, long-term weather. It's just climate is this thing we call climate. It's a period of time, usually, 30, 60, 120 years. And so if you're seeing natural variability over 30-year cycles, well, then you can't say that that's a trend of increased acceleration of sea level rise. Sea level has been rising since at least the 19th century. That was also when we started studying it. But then what they do is they say, okay, well, then we have to go find other measures. So they'll then use other measures. They love satellite data. That requires a lot of assumptions. Then there's all these other indirect measures like salt marshes or coral. They're indirect. You have to ask yourself, why are you even using indirect measures if you have a direct measure in the form of tide gauge data? And the answer is because they can't show an acceleration otherwise. That's the real answer. It's really cherry picking is probably the right single word to describe what they're doing, but also some model manipulation, and then just hiding a lot of these other findings so that most people that don't want to spend a lot of time reading these documents, most of them end up never seeing. It's like the way that all this stuff, cancel culture, censorship, they're always they're getting really into the weeds where people stop paying attention. That's where a lot of the mischief occurs. I think there's a lot of intimidation of the technical and scientific side of these things, but you don't actually have to know a lot of other details about what they're doing to just know that if you just get to the core empirical data, then there's really no basis for them introducing, this other indirect forms of data, short-term data, or this elaborate modeling exercises.
So is this the same thing that happened when it comes to catastrophic weather or hurricanes and damage? I mean, on the one hand, there just isn't an increase in these factors that I'm aware of. On the other hand, the reporting tells you there's this dramatic increase and that's evidence of this, the apocalyptic vision or the evidence that it's an existential issue and so forth. Or was this just simply misrepresenting reality? Which is it?
Yeah, it's very similar. I think the extreme weather has a lot of similarities to the sea level rise manipulations. Let's take kind of the biggest one by far as hurricanes. If you properly measure hurricanes over 100, 150 years, there's been no increase in landfalling hurricanes during that time. Like, full stop. There's just no trend. I think I've seen some people actually produce a slightly declining trend, but basically no trend in landfalling hurricanes. Now, we do have new ways to measure hurricanes, which is with satellite data. So if you don't adjust the data to account for better detection of hurricanes, and you don't do landfalling hurricanes, for example, if you do all hurricanes, because of course, then you can show an increase because the satellites are better at detecting hurricanes offshore now, obviously, than just, like, is there a hurricane out there?
Yeah.
So there's actually two graphs I point out, one by Financial Times, one by the New York Times, that do two different manipulations. The Financial Times doesn't correct for the change of technology to measure hurricanes. So it's completely irresponsible. I mean, I don't know how else to say. It's misinformation. I mean, or disinformation, depending on what they understood. The New York Times then does the time series trick. So you don't have a long enough period of time to show a trend. In other cases, it's sort of somewhat different. On the fires, it's multiple things, because there's sort of the total amount of land that's on fire has declined. So you can't say that climate change has caused an increase in the amount of land on fire. But even on that, Jan, it's also, even that's almost a misleading piece of data, because fire is not necessarily bad. A lot of our forests need fire. Fire clears out the underbrush. It often allows the seeds to be able to germinate. And so it's not like even fires are bad. It might be that we should have more fires, right? In some places, depends. But then the other one is the high intensity fires. And this is the craziest one. And I was absolutely pilloried for saying this at the time. And now I look back and think I didn't say it even strong enough. All of the increase of high intensity fires, all of it, can be explained by poor forest management. You just allow woody debris to accumulate, and you're going to get these big bonfires in the forest that are bad in the sense that they burn the crowns of the trees and destroy the whole tree, as opposed to these low level, less hot fires that's natural and good and positive in terms of burning out the undergrowth. So all of it is about forest management. And then they would say, well, you can't say that there's not some role of climate change. And I guess what I would say is, yeah, slightly warmer weather, you could say, added some kind of unmeasurable additional heat, but it's so small and irrelevant compared to the accumulation of wood fuel that adding it as a cause, and it's all through modeling is the other thing. They can't show it. That's your first sign that there's some mischief that they're doing, because you have to ask, well, why are we modeling it at all if we have real world data?
Well, Michael Shellenberger, it's such a pleasure to have had you on again.
It's great to be with you, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Michael Shellenberger and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.